Sarah Chen wiped down another table at Mason's diner, her lower back aching as she reached across the worn Formica surface. 6 months pregnant and still pulling double shifts. Not exactly how she'd imagined her life at 32. But her research fellowship at Columbia Medical Center wouldn't fund itself, and her advisor's grant money had dried up 3 months ago. The lunch rush had died down, leaving only a few regulars nursing their coffee cups. That's when he walked in, tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her yearly rent, Italian leather briefcase, and that unmistakable air of someone used to being in charge. He chose a booth by the window, barely glancing at her as she approached with a menu. "Just coffee, Black," he said, already immersed in his phone. Sarah nodded, used to the dismissive treatment. As she turned to leave, she noticed his wallet sitting on the table's edge, expensive leather, slightly worn. A test, she realized immediately. Her years in behavioral psychology hadn't been wasted. She cleared her throat. "Sir, you might want to secure your wallet. It could easily fall." He looked up, really seeing her for the first time. James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Biotech, studied her with sharp blue eyes. The corners of his mouth twitched upward. "Most people would have just taken it," he said, leaving the wallet where it was. "Especially someone in your condition." Sarah's spine stiffened. "Most people aren't working on their PhD in neuropsychology while trying to develop new treatments for childhood trauma," she replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Your coffee will be right out, sir." She could feel his eyes following her as she walked away, one hand absently rubbing her swollen belly. Her research partner, Olivia, had warned her about Morrison Biotech's reputation for stealing promising research from underfunded labs. Was this some kind of corporate espionage? When she returned with his coffee, the wallet was gone. He was studying her name tag with unusual intensity. "Sarah, you said something about childhood trauma research?" "I did." She set down his coffee with practiced precision. "Though I'm sure you have more interesting things to focus on than a waitress's side projects. Try me." He gestured to the empty seat across from him. "I've got 20 minutes before my next meeting, and childhood trauma happens to be a particular interest of mine." Her first instinct was to decline, but something in his expression made her pause. There was a flicker of something behind the corporate mask. Pain, maybe, or recognition. She glanced at the nearly empty diner, then carefully lowered herself into the booth. "My research focuses on early intervention protocols for children who've experienced severe trauma," she explained, watching his reaction carefully. "Specifically, I'm developing new therapeutic approaches that combine traditional cognitive behavioral therapy with targeted neuroplasticity exercises." Morrison leaned forward, coffee forgotten. "You're talking about rewiring neural pathways during the critical development period?" "Exactly." Sarah's excitement briefly overcame her suspicion. The brain's ability to form new connections is highest in childhood. If we can intervene early enough, with the right combination of therapeutic techniques, we might be able to prevent the long-term effects of trauma before they become permanently encoded, he finished. His voice had lost its corporate polish, replaced by genuine enthusiasm. Sarah nodded, studying his face more carefully now. "Most people don't grasp the concept that quickly. You seem unusually well-informed about developmental psychology." Morrison's expression shifted, a shadow passing behind his eyes. "Let's just say I have personal experience with the long-term effects you're trying to prevent." He pulled out his phone, checking the time. "Listen, I'd like to hear more about your research. The real reason I'm in this part of town. I'm looking for promising projects to fund through Morrison Biotech's new charitable foundation. Her heart skipped a beat, but caution kept her voice level. That's quite a coincidence, though I have to wonder why you'd test potential grant recipients by leaving your wallet out. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Old habits. I grew up in foster care, learned early to test people's intentions. Sometimes I still fall back on those instincts when making important decisions. The admission hung between them, shifting the dynamic. Sarah saw him differently now, not just as a powerful CEO, but as someone who'd walked through fire and emerged determined to prevent others from getting burned. All due respect, Mr. Morrison, but if you're really interested in my research, I'd prefer to present it properly, not while I'm wearing an apron and carrying a coffee pot. A genuine smile spread across his face. Fair enough. How about tomorrow morning at my office? 9 a.m. He pulled out a business card, then hesitated. Bring your full proposal, and maybe we can discuss why a PhD candidate is waiting tables while 6 months pregnant. Sarah took the card, her mind already racing. I'll be there. Though I should warn you, my research partner will insist on coming too. She's quite protective. Bring her. The more minds working on this, the better. He stood, leaving a $100 bill under his coffee cup. And Sarah? The wallet test? You didn't just pass it. You called me out on it. That says more about your character than any proposal could. Sarah watched him leave, then sank back into the booth, her hand trembling slightly as she held his business card. Morrison Biotech. The same company she'd been cursing just last week when they'd outbid her lab for crucial research equipment. And now, girl, was that who I think it was? Darlene, the senior waitress, slid into the seat Morrison had vacated. Tell me you got something good out of that interaction, because I saw the way he was looking at you, like you were a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. I have a meeting tomorrow morning, at his office. Sarah could hardly believe her own words. He wants to hear about my research. Darlene's eyes widened. Research? Honey, I thought you were taking classes at the community college. Sarah felt a flush of guilt. She'd never corrected her co-workers' assumptions, finding it easier to let them think she was just another struggling student. It's complicated. I should probably tell you. But before she could continue, her phone buzzed. Olivia's name flashed on the screen, along with a message that made her blood run cold. Emergency. Lab's been broken into. Everything's gone. Get here now. Sarah struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. Darlene, I have to go. Family emergency. The lie tasted bitter, but she couldn't explain the truth. Not yet. Go, go, I'll cover your tables. Darlene's concerned expression followed her as she hurried to the back room for her bag. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood in her ransacked lab, watching Olivia pace between overturned filing cabinets and empty hard drive enclosures. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Olivia fumed. All our research data, the prototype protocols, even the backup drives. Gone. Sarah clutched Morrison's business card in her pocket, a terrible suspicion forming. The timing's too perfect, Olivia said, running her hands through her short, dark hair. Morrison shows up at your diner, plays nice, and suddenly our lab gets hit. He's trying to steal our research before we can publish. Sarah sank into her desk chair, mind racing. But why go through the charade? Why offer to meet tomorrow if they were just going to take everything? To keep us distracted? To have an alibi? Olivia stopped pacing. Wait. You're not still planning to go to that meeting? Actually, I am. Sarah pulled out her tablet, the one thing she never left at the lab. Because what they stole were copies. The originals are all right here. She patted her belly with a small smile. Being pregnant makes everyone underestimate you. After we lost that equipment bid to Morrison, I started keeping everything important with me. Olivia's eyes widened. You brilliant, paranoid woman. She leaned against a desk. So what's the play? Sarah opened her calendar app. Tomorrow morning, we walk into that meeting exactly as planned. If Morrison's behind this, he'll expect us to cancel. Instead, we're going to watch his face very carefully when we present our complete, intact research. And if he's not behind it, then we've got bigger problems. Sarah started gathering the scattered papers. Either way, I need to call in a favor from my old mentor at the FBI's cybercrime division. Something about this feels wrong, like we're missing a crucial piece. They spent the next hour documenting the break-in, taking photos, and making lists of everything that was taken. Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Morrison's face when he talked about foster care. There had been raw truth in that moment. Her years of studying human behavior told her he hadn't been lying. What if, she said slowly, this isn't about stealing our research at all? What if it's about discrediting it? Olivia paused in her photographing of the damaged lock. Discrediting? Why would anyone want to? Think about it, Sarah interrupted. Our research could revolutionize how the foster care system handles trauma cases. That means massive policy changes, new mandatory protocols, increased funding requirements. And a lot of people who profit from the current broken system would lose money, Olivia finished, including some of Morrison Biotech's biggest institutional investors. She lowered her camera. But that still doesn't tell us if Morrison is friend or foe. Sarah checked the time, nearly midnight. We've got 9 hours to prepare for that meeting. Let's make them count. She pulled up their presentation files. And I think I know exactly how to force Morrison to show his true colors. The next morning, Sarah stood in front of Morrison Biotech's gleaming headquarters, smoothing her borrowed maternity blazer. Olivia squeezed her arm. Ready? The security guard did a double take when they gave their names. Mr. Morrison left specific instructions. Please follow me to the executive elevator. They were whisked up to the top floor, where Morrison himself waited in the corridor. He looked surprised. But was it because they'd shown up, or because they didn't cancel? Dr. Chen, Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for coming. He gestured toward a conference room. I hope you don't mind, but I've invited a few other interested parties to hear your presentation. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when they entered the room. Seated at the table was Judge Patricia Manning, head of the state's family court system, and beside her, looking exactly as he had 15 years ago when he'd been Sarah's own foster father, sat Michael Harrison. Morrison must have seen her reaction. Is everything all right, Doctor? Chen? Perfect, she managed, though her hands shook as she set up her tablet. In fact, this couldn't be better. Sarah met Harrison's eyes, watching recognition slowly dawn on his face. He'd been a prominent figure in the foster care system, praised publicly for taking in so many troubled teens. Only his foster children knew the truth about what happened behind closed doors. Before we begin, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, I'd like to address last night's break-in at our lab. She watched their faces carefully. Morrison looked genuinely startled. Harrison's expression didn't change, too practiced at hiding reactions. Break in. Morrison leaned forward. I wasn't aware. Are you saying your research was stolen? They tried. Sarah opened her presentation. Fortunately, I've learned to be prepared for unexpected complications. Judge Manning, I'm particularly glad you're here. There are some aspects of our research that directly relate to cases you've overseen. Harrison shifted in his chair, almost imperceptibly. Sarah continued, pulling up the first slide. Neurological patterns in childhood trauma, a 15-year longitudinal study. Our research began with a specific case study, Sarah explained, clicking to the next slide. Subject A, age 15, placed in foster care after parental death. Documented physical and psychological trauma during placement. Subject later went on to earn a PhD in neuropsychology, specifically to understand and prevent similar trauma in others. She paused, letting her words sink in. I am Subject A, and Mr. Harrison, I believe you remember the circumstances that inspired this research. The room went completely still. Harrison's facade cracked slightly, but before he could speak, Judge Manning straightened in her chair. Mr. Harrison, I strongly suggest you don't say anything without legal representation. Morrison's eyes darted between Sarah and Harrison, understanding dawning on his face. The break-in, he said quietly. It wasn't about stealing the research. It was about burying it. 15 years of documented cases, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. Not just my experience, but patterns repeated across multiple homes, multiple states. Our research doesn't just prove the neurological impact. It proves the systematic nature of the abuse. And more importantly, it proves how many people knew and did nothing. Harrison stood abruptly. This is absurd. I've dedicated my life to helping children. You can't possibly think anyone will believe. Sit down, Michael. Judge Manning's voice cut through the room like steel. Dr. Chen, please continue. And know that everything you present here today will be entered into official record. Morrison had been silent, his expression unreadable. Now he pressed a button on the conference room phone. Security, please come to the executive conference room and contact NYPD. We'll need them as well. Sarah met his eyes, seeing her own pain reflected there. You knew, didn't you? Not about Harrison specifically, but you knew something was wrong in the system. My own experiences were different, Morrison said quietly. But when I gained the resources to investigate, I started finding patterns. That's why I created the foundation. We've been gathering evidence, building a case. He smiled grimly. Your research is the final piece we needed. Olivia, who had been quietly recording everything on her phone, spoke up. The break-in. You had nothing to do with it? No, but I know who did. Morrison pulled out his phone, showing them an email. This morning, I received an anonymous tip about questionable research methods at your lab. Someone was trying to discredit you before you could present your findings. Security arrived as Harrison tried to make a break for the door. Judge Manning was already on her phone, speaking rapidly about emergency injunctions and investigation orders. Sarah sat down, suddenly exhausted. All these years, she whispered. I thought I was just working on a treatment protocol. I never imagined. Morrison moved to stand beside her chair. You were doing exactly what I've been trying to do, creating real change. But you went about it the right way, building irrefutable scientific evidence, while I've just been throwing money at the problem, hoping something would stick. The foundation, Sarah realized. You weren't really looking for new projects to fund. You were looking for survivors who'd fought back. I was looking for allies, he corrected. People who understood the depth of the problem and had the skills to help fix it. When you called me out on the wallet test, I knew you were someone who'd been forced to learn to read people's true intentions. Through the glass walls of the conference room, they could see police officers arriving. Harrison sat rigidly in his chair, all pretense gone, while Judge Manning explained the situation to the officers. Olivia squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "You okay?" "Better than okay," Sarah replied, one hand resting on her belly. "For the first time, I feel like everything makes sense." "Dr. Chen," Morrison said, "I'd like to offer you more than just funding. Morrison Biotech has a fully equipped research facility, and we're establishing a new division focused on trauma treatment and prevention. We need someone to lead it, someone who understands the science and the human cost." Sarah looked up sharply. "You want me to run the division? You've already done the hardest part, building the foundation for change. Now you just need the resources to implement it." He glanced at her pregnant belly. "And I promise better hours than waiting tables." Judge Manning rejoined them, her face grave but determined. "Dr. Chen, your testimony will be crucial in the coming months. Are you prepared for what that means?" Sarah thought about all the children still trapped in situations like she had been, about the system that had failed them, about the chance to finally make real change. "I've been preparing for this my entire life," she said. "I just didn't know it." The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and preliminary paperwork. By late afternoon, Sarah found herself back in Morrison's office, watching the city spread out below as the sun began to set. "Why did you really come to the diner yesterday?" she asked. Morrison smiled. "One of my investigators flagged your research proposal when it was submitted for grant consideration. Your background caught my attention. Foster care survivor turned neuroscientist, focusing on childhood trauma. But corporations like mine get accused of stealing research all the time. I needed to know if you were the real deal." So the wallet test was about integrity, yes. But more than that, I wanted to see if you'd confront me directly. Survivors who've healed don't just avoid taking advantage. They stand up to power. Sarah nodded, understanding. "And now?" "Now we have work to do," Morrison said, handing her a thick folder. "This contains every case we've documented, every suspicious pattern we've tracked. Combined with your research, it's enough to force a complete overhaul of the system." Sarah opened the folder, her eyes widening at the scope of the investigation. These cases go back decades and span multiple states. People like Harrison didn't operate in isolation. They had enablers, people who looked the other way, bureaucrats who buried reports. Morrison's voice hardened. "We're going to expose all of them." "It won't be easy," Sarah warned. "The system protects its own. They'll fight back." "Let them." Morrison smiled grimly. "Between your science and my resources, we've got something they've never faced before. Proof they can't ignore or discredit." Sarah closed the folder, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. But for the first time, it felt like a weight she could carry. Later that night, back in her small apartment, Sarah sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers. Olivia had gone home hours ago, after making her promise to get some rest. But sleep felt impossible with everything that had happened. She pulled out her old journal, the one she'd started 15 years ago, documenting everything in careful, clinical detail. Even then, some part of her had known this day would come, had known she'd need every scrap of evidence to fight this battle. Her baby kicked, as if sensing her thoughts. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered, rubbing her belly. "The world you're coming into, it's going to be better." I promise. Her phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. Meeting tomorrow at 9. Time to start changing the world. Sarah smiled, finally feeling ready for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, she wasn't facing them alone. As she got ready for bed, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked different somehow, stronger, more determined. The scared 15-year-old girl who'd once documented her trauma in secret was now a woman with the power to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Her research had started as a way to understand her own past. Now it would help shape the future for countless children. The thought filled her with a sense of purpose she'd never felt before. Full circle, she murmured, turning out the light. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for every child trapped in a broken system. And this time, she had the knowledge, the evidence, and the allies to make real change happen. The night settled around her, peaceful for the first time in years. She'd finally found her way home.